Everything has been said about Rome, but far from everything is understood. This empire gave the world laws, roads, a military machine, and architecture. But behind its facade, shadows remain. Vanished cults, undeciphered prophecies, buildings that defy explanation. Hidden beneath the streets of ancient Rome were ritual chambers that even the emperor was forbidden to enter. Some temples were oriented to stars that are not visible from Earth. A hall has been discovered in the Colosseum that has neither an entrance nor any acoustic logic. And the legions that disappeared without a fight have become part of legends that official history prefers not to delve into. In this video, we'll explore 20 real-life mysteries of the Roman Empire that, even a millennium later, continue to baffle researchers and archaeologists, from temples without gods to machines ahead of their time, from texts that were forbidden to be read aloud to cults of which not a single image remains. We'll delve into a side of Rome that's not written about in school textbooks, one that's been deliberately left beyond our comprehension, and the deeper you look, the less it seems like it ever disappeared. With Evelyn books, texts that could not be read to the end, in the very heart of Rome, beneath the foundations of one of its most ancient hills, the Capitol, an object was kept for centuries that even those who ruled the world obeyed. These were the Sibylline books, a collection of prophecies that no one could read without the Senate's permission. No one, not even the emperor. They were feared, yet they were consulted at the most critical moments, during wars, epidemics, and disasters. No one knew exactly what they contained, but one thing was clear. Every line could change the decision of all of Rome. According to legend, the books were brought to King Tarquinius the Proud by an ancient Sibyl, a priestess from Cumaea, dressed in shadow and speaking in riddles. She offered to sell the king 9 scrolls. He refused, considering the price too high. Then she burned 3 and offered again. He refused again. She burned 3 more and offered the remaining 3 at the same price. Only then did Tarquinius realize that each scroll burned didn't devalue the remaining ones. It made them unique. He agreed. These 3 books formed the basis of an archive that Rome would fear more than any enemy. The Sibylline books were hidden in the Temple of Jupiter Capitolinus. Their contents were not published. Whenever a threat arose, a fire, a flood, an eclipse, a rebellion, the Senate appointed a special college of priests who opened the books and interpreted passages. Not everything, only what was permitted. These prophecies were perceived not as superstition, but as legally binding recommendations. They were used to order sacrifices, postpone holidays, and even cancel military campaigns. The mystery became a state mechanism. What exactly these texts contained is unknown, but fragments and indirect quotations have survived, repeated in late Roman literature. They often contain formulas constructed as a warning. When the 9th does not return, consider that the shadow has come forward. The seal will remain intact until time abandons the name. Do not open until the smoke turns golden. These phrases are impossible to interpret precisely, but they appeared in a variety of chronicles, letters, inscriptions, and sometimes even in private diaries. It was as if the language of books was seeping into everyday life, and someone was continuing to rewrite them, just like a miasma that can't be stopped, but can be felt. In 83 BC, the Temple of Jupiter burned down. The fire destroyed not only statues and gold, but also books. It is believed that this was an accident, but one of the chroniclers, Lucius Cornelius Sisenna, writes of a fire that started not from outside, but from within the walls, where no one stored oil or torches. Too profound, too precise. After the fire, the Senate began collecting new texts, Sibylline prophecies from all over Italy. They were brought from Erythrae, Girgis, Phrygia, even Syria. They were collated, cleaned, rewritten. A new collection was created. Once again, it was forbidden to read without permission, but not for long. In 405 AD, Emperor Honorius and the Christian Senate decreed the destruction of the Sibylline books. The official reason given was their pagan nature. However, private letters preserved a different version. They claimed that some of the texts crossed the line and contained prophecies that violated chronology. If this is true, then the text contained information that was perceived not as mysticism, but as a threat to the historical order. Question: if the books were destroyed, why did their language continue to exist? Why do individual phrases appear in Probus, Macrobius, and Pliny? Why do the chronicles of late Rome contain formulas that are not characteristic of Latin poetics, but coincide in structure with the prophetic speeches of the East? Some researchers suggest that the books were never completely destroyed. Some may have been hidden, perhaps transferred to the Library of Alexandria. There is a hypothesis that the underground storage areas beneath the Palatine were used not only as ritual spaces, but also as an archive to which one could return. And perhaps they did return. There are documents that mention secret readings during the times of Augustus and Trajan, not public, not sanctioned by the Senate. Perhaps the emperors, especially in moments of instability, turned to the text directly, without intermediaries. They broke the rules. They searched the lines for something that didn't belong to the world of the gods, but rather to the structure of time. And perhaps they found it. The Sibylline books are more than just an ancient collection. They are a monument to civilization's fear of knowledge that can not only predict, but also change the structure of reality. That's why they were destroyed, not because they were pagan, but because they were dangerous. And if some of them still exist somewhere, perhaps there is someone who continues to read them, not for salvation, but to test the line between prophecy and the architecture of the future. Temple of Mithras, the god feared too late. During the Roman Empire, mysterious underground sanctuaries began to be built across Europe. They were small, windowless, carved underground or into rock, always with a single entrance and complex internal geometry. These temples were called Mithraeums, and they worshipped a god who was not in the official pantheon. His name was Mithra. Not a single Roman source explains where it came from. It wasn't mentioned in state sacrifices. It didn't feature in imperial festivals, but it was everywhere. According to archaeological evidence, by the 3rd century, Mithraism had spread to dozens of provinces, from Britain to Syria. His temples were found under pitchforks, amphitheaters, and barracks. But most importantly, women were not allowed inside, and no one except the initiated knew what exactly happened inside. In the center of each Mithraeum stood a scene, a bas-relief depicting Mithras slaying a bull. His robe fluttered, his gaze turned upward. Nearby were snakes, dogs, and a raven. The bull's blood fell to the ground, and from it life was born. But no one explained the meaning of this image. Not a single source of the time provides a decipherment. And yet, Mithraism became one of the most influential closed religions of the empire, competing with Christianity. Historians claim that the cult of Mithras originated in Persia. But the Persian Mithras, the god of light and covenant, is nothing like the Roman one. There, he was solar and public. Here, he was subterranean and secret. Between them, only a name. It's as if someone took a figure from a foreign mythology and imbued him with a completely different essence. One, impossible to discuss. The initiation stages have been preserved. There were 7 in total, from raven to father. At each level, initiates underwent rituals that no one else has recreated. Only descriptions remain. Ablutions, silence, blood sacrifice. No records. Only sculptures duplicating the same gesture. A hand pressed to the heart. Eyes closed. Later, Christian church fathers called Mithraism a false light and a double of truth. Some wrote directly, Mithra knew that Christ was coming, and therefore, he got ahead of him. The strangest thing is that the vast majority of Mithraeums were intentionally filled in and sealed. In some, archaeologists found traces of destruction, but not violence. Stacked stones, neatly sealed niches, cleanly cut entrances. It's as if the followers of Mithras themselves destroyed their sanctuaries, not out of fear, but out of necessity. Perhaps because something in these temples had to remain underground. A Mithraeum in Ostia was excavated in the 20th century. A rare anomaly was discovered there. The stone benches showed signs of repeated heating, as if someone had sat on them, radiating heat. The walls were polished on the inside, and there was a hole in the ceiling that coincided with the position of Sirius on certain days of the year. And the most inexplicable thing was that on the central slab, where the bas-relief should have been, there was nothing. The stone was smooth, and in its center was only the imprint of a human palm, not carved, imprinted into the structure of the material, as if it had formed at a moment when the stone had not yet cooled. But analysis showed, the rock is ancient, millions of years old. The cult disappeared suddenly, within a few decades. Too quickly to be a natural extinction, all that remained were empty Mithraeums and shadows of symbols that no one had deciphered. Some researchers are certain that Mithraism did not disappear. It disappeared, or fell silent. Perhaps because what it brought no longer required people, or it found other bearers. And if someone ever decides to restore one of the rituals, starting with the simple sign of the bull, they might not be reviving a cult. They'll be returning a channel, and that's no longer a religion. It's a structure, and such things don't forgive mistakes. The legion that never returned. The 9th Legion of the Roman Empire, Legionem Hispana, was one of the most formidable and respected military formations of its time. It participated in the conquest of Gaul, the suppression of rebellions in Spain and Britain, and served under the command of Julius Caesar himself. His story is a journey of blood, iron, and discipline. And at the same time, it is one of the darkest secrets, one that even the imperial chronicles remain silent about. The mystery first arises in Britain, at the beginning of the 2nd century. The 9th Legion, based in the fortress of Eboracum, modern York, suddenly disappears from all records. Before that, there were regular mentions, salaries, supplies, a change of command, and then silence, a complete absence. No reports, no transfer orders, no trace of disbandment. It was as if the Legion had completely vanished. Later, in the 20th century, scholars proposed a theory. The 9th Legion was destroyed in Britain during a rebellion by local tribes, but there is no archaeological evidence or mass graves to support this theory. Not a single corpse, not a single shield bearing the insignia of the 9th was found. Even the coins that legionnaires always carried with them never surfaced in the excavations. More than one person disappeared. An entire structure vanished, with standards, archives, warehouses, and the legionary emblem. Some historians claim that part of the legion may have been transferred to Germany. But then the question arises, why does his name not appear in any records of the Rhine legions? Why are there no mixed units? Rome didn't lose armies without a trace. Every penny, every weapon bearer was accounted for, and a disappearance of such magnitude, even if shameful, should have been documented. Instead, there's nothing but emptiness. The mystery of the 9th first came to light in the 19th century when British scientists began to study the tablets found in Vindolanda. These tablets, correspondence between Roman officers on wooden tablets, abruptly end precisely at the mention of sending reinforcements to the 9th Legion. The final tablet ends with the phrase, "If the gates are still open by that time, send a standard, but not men." The phrase is strange. Gates? What gates? Why is a sign more important than people? And why, from this very moment, does not only the Legion itself disappear, but also all mention of it? Some researchers have put forward a more mystical version. Perhaps the Legion was sent not to suppress the uprising, but to perform a special task, to guard or capture an object that was not to be made public. Perhaps the Romans encountered something that couldn't be explained within the framework of the traditional world. An artifact, a temple, a cult, knowledge. And perhaps contact with it meant not death, but extinction. Not physical, but structural. There are suggestions that the Legion participated in a ritual associated with a northern cult worshipped by the Celts on the border of Pictish lands, a rite in which the army's role is not that of protector, but of victim. There's no confirmation of this, but strange signs are still being found in the area where Ix disappeared. Rings made of black basalt, not typical for these lands, and columns standing at an angle to the horizon. Locals consider these to be sleeping clocks. Yet one detail is particularly disturbing. In the Lindisfarne Monastery manuscripts, written as early as the 7th century, there is a passage describing the arrival of a dark column dressed in gold, but without faces. A monk writes that during these days, the sun did not touch the earth, and time went backwards. And no one knew what day it had been the day before. A coincidence? Or a trace of memory remaining in the cultural fabric 500 years after its disappearance? Some are certain the 9th was not destroyed. He was taken out of time. Perhaps Rome itself initiated this, as part of an experiment or a ritual. An empire obsessed with control could decide to take a step in which the army becomes not an instrument of power, but a link between realities. A kind of lock, a final seal. And if that's true, then the 9th Legion isn't a vanished army, but a structure still dormant somewhere on the edge of the world. And when the gates open again, perhaps they will be the first through. X-frames without gods. Throughout the territory of the former Roman Empire, archaeologists find temples. Many of them, some are destroyed, others are partially preserved, and still others have been converted into churches or secular buildings. But there's a special category of buildings that send shivers down your spine, not because of their architecture, but because of their silence. These are temples that have no images of gods, no inscriptions, no altars, temples that literally have no purpose. They're called sacred voids, and there are dozens of them. The first thing that catches your eye is the geometry. These buildings are constructed with precision, perfectly symmetrical halls, exquisite acoustics, and in some places, zone fields, where the voice disappears even if you shout. The plans of these temples are usually oriented not toward the sun or the cardinal directions, but along unknown axes. Sometimes they point to a point where nothing happens. Sometimes they point to a plot of land that doesn't produce a magnetic reaction. And most importantly, they cannot be attributed to a specific cult. They are not dedicated to Jupiter, Venus, or Mars. They do not resemble Mithraic sanctuaries. They show no traces of sacrifices, and the canonical column shapes are absent. These structures seem to be architectural containers, but what they contained is unclear. Or who? In one of these temples, in Syracuse, archaeologists found a strange feature. The central hall, carved in limestone, had walls covered with tiny indentations. As it turned out later, they coincided with a resonance system. If a sound of a certain frequency was pronounced, these niches began to vibrate. No Roman text describes such an architectural application, but as a result of the experiment, it was possible to record a strange effect. The sound, once launched, continued to fluctuate for up to 15 minutes, without repetition, without amplifiers. Some believe these temples are an instrument, a conscious one, perhaps connected not with worship, but with perception, as if they were places where they didn't pray, but waited, didn't talk, but listened, didn't address the gods, but accepted what came. An even more mysterious structure was discovered in southern Gaul. There, beneath a fortress dating back to the time of Augustus, a hall was found carved into the rock, with a perfectly circular chamber and 3 steps leading downwards. Below is a niche where something clearly once stood. But what is unclear? There are no traces of fastenings, no channel for offerings, no images. But on the floor is an engraved spiral that disappears under the stone. Underground scanning showed that the spiral continues to a depth of more than 6 meters, but it is impossible to excavate it. It is located inside a monolithic slab. Some researchers call these temples corridors of silence. Perhaps they were built not as places of worship, but as protective spaces. Protective, not from enemies, but from knowledge, from that which should not come to light, or conversely, from that which should not disappear completely. There's a theory that these were reservoirs, not for water, not for storage, but for memory, not in the human sense, but as a way to capture a state unrelated to language, and that sometimes, in certain weather or sounds, this recording is activated. There have been cases where tourists inside such temples began to experience events that didn't happen to them. They saw unfamiliar scenes, heard phrases they didn't understand, and experienced unexplained anxiety. This is not superstition. It is a phenomenon recorded in Egypt, India, and some ancient mosques. All these structures have another common feature. The entrance is often hidden behind a layer of stone or absent altogether, as if no one was supposed to go inside, or as if those inside were not supposed to leave. In Rome, there are drawings showing non-existent buildings. On paper, it's a temple. In reality, it's nothing. But when scanning these plots of land, sharp dips in soil density are detected. No catacombs, just emptiness. As if the architecture had been cut out of the space itself and then removed, not physically, but conceptually. And yet, it is felt. These temples are not memory, and not religion. They are like a frozen point in the fabric of time, a question no one dared to ask. Perhaps it was precisely because they knew that anyone who asked it would not receive an answer. They would only receive a presence, and it would remain. Forgotten machines of Rome. When we talk about the technologies of the Roman Empire, the first things that come to mind are roads, aqueducts, and arches. Simple, clear, and elegant in engineering. But there were other designs too, those whose purpose raises questions even today. In archaeological reports, they are listed as mechanisms of unknown use, Or more simply, machines that don't fit the context of their time. In 1901, a fragment of a bronze gear was found during excavations on the slope of the Palatine Hill. Initially, it was thought to be from a water wheel, but further analysis revealed that the tooth angles, the material, and the aspect ratio were not typical of Roman water engineering. This gear was part of a much more complex device. Later, scientists attempted to reconstruct its possible structure. The result, a mechanism with a double revolution counter, a switching cycle, and a balancing element. What it counted is unknown, but it clearly wasn't pumping water. Some believe it was an astronomical device. Not as complex as the Antikythera mechanism, but not primitive either. However, the date established from the sediments is confusing. The 1st century BC. Too early, too precise, and too local. No such parts have been found in this region before or since. Another case is a discovery in Ostia. There, among the ruins of a Roman warehouse, a system of canals was discovered that did not lead to the sea. Inside them were traces of lead partitions with neat holes resembling filters. Engineers who examined the structure concluded that the system functioned as a kind of distillation chamber, but not for water. No traces of organic matter were found. However, the temperature of the walls was higher than that of other surrounding objects. Even centuries later, it was as if the structure itself retained residual heat. And then one researcher suggested, what if this was a technical system for capturing odors, vapors, or sounds? We're used to the idea that everything in Rome served a practical purpose, but that's a modern assumption. We don't have a single complete blueprint. There are no factories, no instructions, no people who created these machines, only bits and pieces. And these pieces don't add up to useful utensils. They create an image of what looks more like sensors, reactors, surveillance cameras. Not in the digital sense, but in the sense of perceiving the environment. Here, carved from a single piece of quartz, was discovered in the dungeons of Naples. It shows no signs of fastenings. It is not fixed, but is perfectly centered in a niche. Light falling through a narrow opening in the ceiling is focused directly onto the center of this lens on certain days of the year. Not for display, for concentration. Underneath is a small reservoir, but there is nothing in it, just smooth glass, no ash, no dust, as if it cleans itself. Such objects are called non-functional artifacts. It's a convenient term to acknowledge that we don't understand their purpose. But when you put them together, a different picture emerges. A picture of systems that don't interact with people directly, but seem to register their presence, not as a user, but as a trigger. There are no levers inside, no knobs. Everything either works on its own, or not at all. The Romans believed that certain forms of matter had a will of their own. Chronicles describe stones that refuse to be laid down, columns that change color when soldiers approach, and statues that echoed sounds that were not there. These were considered part of the world. And perhaps these machines weren't for control, but for connection. It's hard to say between what and what, but one of the surviving inscriptions in Pompeii reads, "When the ring closes, the mechanism will hear again." Too poetic? Perhaps. But why do such inscriptions appear only near architectural anomalies? Why are these mechanisms most often found not in temples or workshops, but in border zones? Between the city and the void? Between light and shadow? Some theories suggest that these objects could be part of a synchronized network, perhaps linked to astronomical cycles, or to sound vibrations, or to what would now be called energy grids. But then we must admit, Rome knew more than we think, and not everything it built was meant for us. Or maybe some of those machines still work. We've just forgotten how to look at them. Talking statues. Statues were ubiquitous in Roman culture. They filled squares, stood in temples, decorated forums, houses, and even baths. They were crafted with meticulous detail, striving not just to reflect appearance, but also to establish presence. They were not decoration, but bearers of power, memory, and sometimes strange functions. Because some of them, according to contemporaries, spoke. The figures to which this refers came to be called talking statues, Latin, statuae locentes. There were several of these in Rome. The most famous was Pasquino, whose history as an object of street satire began in the Middle Ages. People left notes near it with caustic texts, as if the statue were speaking them on its own behalf. But archives contain references to much more ancient talking statues that disappeared long before Pasquino was born. Suetonius wrote about them, and then Apollonius of Tyana. In 96 BC, a statue was discovered on the Campus Martius that produced a sound similar to speech when certain names were spoken nearby. The response was not a clear voice, but a vibration transmitted to the body. This effect was noted not only by priests but also by ordinary soldiers. The Roman historian Varro pointed out that on certain days, certain sculptures could be used to give a sign if one asked a question in one's mind. Neither auditory hallucinations nor hallucinations at all. It was described as a feeling of resolution, a sudden clarity of thought that occurred in the presence of the object. Christians would later call these demonic echoes. The most disturbing incident concerns the Temple of Concordia. There stood a statue of the goddess made of an unusual dark marble. Macrobius's chronicle reports that one day, when the temple was closed for restoration, 3 workers heard hoarse singing. They didn't find the source of this, but the sound repeated the next morning, at exactly the same hour. Then, while dismantling the pedestal, they discovered a cavity beneath the base containing an empty bronze vessel with a spiral pattern. Its purpose was not determined. When they attempted to move the vessel, it crumbled. Since then, the temple has become a place of avoidance. Today, archaeologists sometimes discover statues with internal cavities, which were complex for the bronze technology of the time. Some even have holes leading into the void. It is assumed that this was a resonant acoustic system, an ancient acoustic game, perhaps used to enhance the effect of presence. But in Roman sources, a phrase is found most often alongside the mention of such objects. Non responde voce, sed modo. They respond not with their voice, but with their manner. It is speculated that some statues did not simply depict a deity, but were designed as contact points. They were placed at energetic intersections, for example in temples built along ancient Etruscan lines, and activated on the right day. But activation didn't require sacrifice. What was required was presence, a person possessing a specific state, not faith, not a name, but an internal structure, perhaps a certain emotional frequency. By approaching, he turned on the statue. Holes the size of a human chest was found in the Forum Borea. Upon examination, it was discovered that it contained a cavity lined with smooth stone, but it's impossible to reach. The mechanism is hidden behind a massive pedestal, dismantling which is prohibited due to the risk of damaging the monument. Nevertheless, instruments have shown that a stable temperature and a weak but constant electromagnetic field are maintained inside. Not from the metal, but from the material itself. And then a hypothesis arose. Perhaps these statues were not things, but interfaces. Not idols, not forms, but points of contact with what Rome did not name. With what was simply called numen, power, manifestation. This is not a god. This is an action. They didn't speak, but at the right moment they answered to those who were ready to listen, and perhaps, in some places, they still answer. Distorted calendar. At first glance, the Roman calendar is a model of order. The months are named, the days are numbered, and the holidays are defined down to the last detail. But the more deeply one examines the structure of time in Rome, the clearer it becomes. This order is a mask, because the very principle of counting time in the empire was repeatedly distorted, deliberately. And each time, for reasons that were either not explained or explained too late. The most famous case is the reform of Julius Caesar. In 46 BC, he introduced the Julian calendar to bring the chaotic Roman lunar calendar into alignment with the sun. But for this alignment to work, the year had to be 445 days long. It was called the last year of confusion. And this name is no joke, because after it, something strange began to happen. Certain dates began to repeat, not literally, but in the sense that the same events began to happen on the same dates in different years, as if they were looping. Died on the same day as his father, although we didn't notice. Or, I swore an oath on a secular holiday, but it turned out that today is a day of mourning. Later, Augustus made another change. He renamed the month Sextilis to Augustus, and added a day to it so that it would not be shorter than the month of Caesar, Julius. But this caused a shift in the festivals, and in some places, the days of the gods ended up in inappropriate positions. In the Roman calendar, the days weren't simply listed in order. Each day belonged to a particular god. If a deity found itself on the wrong day, what the priests called confusio occurred. A temporary confusion, when the world failed to recognize itself. There are records of cases where people disappeared between days. In the morning, there was one holiday. In the evening, another. Guard changes occurred twice. Babies were born on a day that was absent the following year. Later, this phenomenon was explained by counting errors, but some scribes thought otherwise. One of them, who lived during the time of Tiberius, has wrote, "A day is not something that follows another day. It is an eye that opens by agreement. And if the agreement is broken, it sees everything at once." Calendar itself comes from Calendi, the day when debt books began counting anew. The calendar was associated not only with time, but also with duty, order, and obligation. What if at some point, Rome realized that the very way of measuring time had become an element of power and ritual? There is evidence that in some temples, priests maintained alternative calendars that did not correspond to the official one. One of these, found in Tivoli, contained months whose names did not correspond to either Greek or Latin sources. It features words like Trisactus, Lyman, Reversio. Are these months ritual stages or states of time that don't fit into a linear model? Thing is that the Roman calendar was officially updated only by special formulas written on tablets and recited on a strictly defined day. These formulas were not part of civil proceedings. They were sacra, that is, sacred. If the formula wasn't pronounced, the year couldn't begin. That is, time itself didn't pass. It was switched on. And if no one switched it on, everything around continued to live, but not in counting, but in a pause. One of the most disturbing cases occurred in 158 CE, when an anomaly in the Fasti, the state list of holidays, occurred. Idus Martii, March 15th, was recorded twice. In Roman culture, this is the day associated with the assassination of Caesar and the turning point of fate. That year saw many strange occurrences: mass disappearances in Liguria, strange flashes of light in the south, and a series of suicides among officials serving on the calendar commission. All of this was attributed to a difficult astrological year, but private letters mentioned something else. We moved forward, but everything came back. I lived through a day that had already happened, and no one noticed. If we accept that the calendar is not simply a calculation, but an interface with reality, then a failure in it is not an error, but an event. Perhaps there were schools in Rome whose priests not only compiled the calendar but also maintained the flow of time, guiding it along the desired trajectory, like a guide. Perhaps the holidays were not dates, but synchronization points. And if they were disrupted, then something could happen, or return. And so, every time the calendar changed, someone disappeared. Not literally, but as if they were erased from the time system. They were still alive, but they no longer fit into the flow of events. And maybe there were more such people than we think. They just didn't go to death, but to failure. Disappeared names. In ancient Rome, everything had a name. Every house, god, street, moon, even the wind from a certain direction. A name was not just a designation, but a form of existence. It was believed that without a name, a thing cannot be perceived, and even less so, cannot interact with others. But for all the Romans' love of recording, in the history of the empire, there is a phenomenon of vanished names, terms that existed, exerted influence, were used in documents, but over time disappeared without a trace. No translations, no reinterpretations. They simply ceased to exist. And in some cases, it was as if they were deliberately erased. One of the most puzzling examples is the name of a city that doesn't exist, which appears in several sources from the Trajan era. Military reports mention a certain Colonia Fief, but the full name is never deciphered. One inscription states that 3 cohorts departed from it, never returning and unrecognized. This colony is not present on any geographical map or in any list of provinces, but the remains of a road leading to nowhere exist. To this day, they are called the Via Omissa, the road that is not remembered. There are numerous similar cases. Temple inscriptions contain names of gods found nowhere else: Centaur, Praxion, Thesra. They cannot be identified with either Greek analogues or local cults. Some inscriptions are accompanied by the phrase, "a name that is pronounced once." And then the question arises, were these goddesses and gods, or something else that could be evoked, but could not be repeated? In the library of the Emperor Tiberius, according to Tacitus, there were tablets containing revoked names, those who were condemned to damnatio memoriae, that is, the curse of memory. But some of these tablets, found fragmentarily, record the names not of people, but of objects, buildings, altars, even seasons. For example, a year Noxialis is mentioned, which is not found in any list. It is said of it, "In it, light did not come, and no one remembered the birth." There's a hypothesis that names in Rome may have served as closed channels. If a name is repeated too often, it drains power. If too rarely, it becomes unstable. Therefore, some gods had two names, one public, the other arcane, known only to the priests. The most famous is with Jupiter. In later lexicon, its second name appears, stator, meaning restraint. Some believe this is not an epithet, but an alternative entity. Almost nothing is known about it, except for the phrase, "Stator does not come, he remains." But there were also names that were not translated, declined, or spoken aloud. They were written as sequences of symbols, sometimes in mirror images, sometimes as geometric shapes. One of the most famous artifacts of this kind is the Erythia stone, carved with 27 symbols that do not belong to any alphabet. The stone was located in a temple of unknown purpose. When an attempt was made to move it in the 19th century, the cart cracked, then the floor cracked, and then the stone disappeared. There are no traces left, only an engraving with a drawing, and on it is the last line, written under the drawing in the owner's hand. The name has returned to itself. The phenomenon of vanished names is particularly evident in Roman colonies. In some of them, there is no mention of temples, but strange, round, doorless structures are found, with a grid of letters interspersed with signs on the walls. Researchers call them sound memory spaces, places where names may have been spoken that were not recorded in writing, but activated by repetition, as if the name were not a given, but an event. And if it was spoken, it could no longer be separated from the speaker. In Stoic philosophy, popular in late Rome, there was an idea. A true name can only be used once, because everything else isn't knowledge, it's repetition. This idea seemed abstract until it was discovered that some Roman rites actually included the act of pronouncing a name, which was immediately crossed out. This wasn't a curse. It was a seal. Today, attempts are being made to reconstruct such names from their context. But perhaps the point is precisely that they cannot be reconstructed, because they haven't disappeared. They have retreated to a realm where the name no longer calls, it observes. Walking walls. In 1985, while carrying out construction work in the basement of an old building on the site of ancient Ostia Antica, workers discovered a fragment of a wall that did not match the style and material of the rest of the structure. A marble block, inlaid with an unknown green rock, was perfectly embedded in the brickwork, but underneath it was a void. When archaeologists excavated the site, they found a room not marked on any plans. Inside, the walls were smooth and unadorned, but one of them, as a later examination would show, was not attached to the foundation. It was separate. Such finds have become increasingly common. Walls moved, displaced, inserted where they shouldn't be. And each time, in places where historical upheavals occurred, changes of power, epidemics, expulsions, a hypothesis arose. These walls were not architectural, but ritual elements, created not to separate space, but to shift perception. In Rome, there was a term, paris vivis, living wall. It was used by priests to describe parts of temples that could not be moved, decorated, or described. They were not to be touched. They knew where to stand, the chronicles said. This is not a metaphor. Perhaps certain sections of the architecture were perceived not as stone, but as active elements interacting with the sacred field. The Romans believed that a place is not a point on a map, but a relationship. And if you change it, not by moving it, but by removing and reinserting it, you can change what happens there. Such rituals are described in priestly treatises, but only partially. One of them, found in Fezina, speaks of a shift in the angle within the axis, after which silence will begin, and then the walls will disappear. In practice, this could mean an attempt to physically edit the space, as if the building were not an object but a carrier of state. The most mysterious walls are found in suburban villas, often in bedrooms or basements. They are distinguished by their acoustics. Sound escapes there, as if absorbed. Scanning reveals that such walls have a heterogeneous internal structure. In one case, the interior was found to consist of alternating layers of brick and an unknown powder, possibly of volcanic origin. But most importantly, GPS doesn't work in these areas, and magnetic compasses are distorted. Even in the 21st century, devices record a temporary discharge. One 2nd century Roman philosopher, Cornelius Frontus, wrote, "A wall that knows its role is silent, but if it is placed where it doesn't belong, it will begin to speak through the silence." What did he mean? Perhaps he was referring to the ancient tradition of movable architectural elements, which could be used in rituals as a kind of seal, not doorways, not secret passages, but semantic barriers marking the beginning of another zone. In late Roman magic, the concept of limes mutatis, the shifted boundary, is well known. This is a boundary that no longer defines a physical division, but rather separates states of reality. Modern theorists have suggested that such walls were used in the ritual of iter reversum, the return journey. It was believed that if a person passed through a certain sequence of rooms, the space would begin to recognize them. But if there's a special wall in the way, a walking one, it can stop this process. Not like a lock, but like forgetting. After it, memory is erased. Some attribute this to the experience of soldiers who, returning from certain regions, couldn't remember the route back, even though they'd walked it many times. One of these memory walls was unearthed during excavations in Salerno. An attempt to transport it resulted in a collapse. Inside is a niche filled with copper tablets engraved with symbols, none of which were identified. They weren't letters. They were variations on forms, circles, crosses, loops. Art historians later recognized this as an architectural language created not for speech, but for impact. What if such walls were part of a system where architecture is not just a physical environment, but a mechanism for knowledge retention, interdiction, and transformation? And if they walked, perhaps not physically, but in the sense of withdrawing from the world when they were no longer needed, or when they became too dangerous to remain in place? Underground cities of Rome. Rome's underground architecture is often discussed. Catacombs, aqueducts, drainage tunnels. All of this has been recorded, measured, and classified. But sometimes these systems contain sections that no one created, but which clearly exist. Blocked tunnels leading to nowhere. Chambers that serve no architectural function. Rooms that show no signs of life, but still retain the echo of a presence. This was first discussed in the 16th century, when the architect Antonio da San Gallo described the strange dungeons beneath the Aventine. He wrote of corridors extending deep underground without branches or ventilation. In one of them, he heard an echo that wasn't there. The stones seemed to hum, as if another sound were embedded within it, trapped in the void. This complex was later closed and never mentioned again. Modern archaeologists acknowledge that some of Rome's underground systems remain unexplored. Some ancient maps show areas designated as sub terra incerta, undefined underground. They are not connected to a water supply or sewer system, but they exist. The so-called zero rooms are particularly strange. These are chambers with no functional entrance. Access is only possible by destroying a wall, and every time someone enters, they find the room absolutely clean. No debris, no traces of life, no organic matter. Only smooth stone, often polished with perfect geometry. Sometimes with unmarked stone platforms. Sometimes with empty niches. But the most frightening thing is that sound disappears in these halls. There were several cases where, when attempting to install acoustic equipment inside, the recording came out blank. The microphones recorded only background noise until entering the hall. Then, silence. Upon exiting, the signal returned to normal. One of the researchers described it this way: "It's not the absence of sound. It's a room where sound doesn't begin." Documents from the late antique period have survived that speak of sealed vaults, supposedly created with the participation of priests. These vaults were not repositories. They were called places of coincidence, points where the flow of time, the course of thought, and the path of souls intersected. Pseudo, Hermapius writes, "There are cities above the earth, but there are others, just like them, only they are not connected with the body, only with memory." The discovery of a huge underground hall in the Vatican area was recorded back in the 19th century. Officially, it was a fragment of a Roman warehouse, but the dimensions described in the report are astonishing. 72 meters long, 18 meters high, and the walls lined with a stone unusual for the region. The structure was soon walled up. The reason given was the danger of collapse, but no photographs survive, only sketches. One shows a staircase descending to the floor. Another shows a symbol on the wall resembling an inverted triumphal wreath. In some texts, this symbol is called the crown of absorption, a sign used to close a passage if it should not be open. Some believe that Rome had two levels of the city. One was physical, the other was the architectonic layer, built not for living, but to coordinate what was happening above, like a filter, a layer of silence between people and what was below, or above. In one of these spaces, under the Conciliatore Street, a niche was discovered in 2009 containing a stone with a date carved into it. Only the date was in the future. DCC 6 Schwaspump AUC, the year 847 from the foundation of Rome. This corresponds to the year 94 AD. The problem is that the stone was buried in layers dating back to the 1st century BC, as if it had been there before it was created. Some call it a coincidence. Others, a violation of the temporal sequence. Still others, a relic of a structure that does not follow chronology. If there is a system beneath Rome that perceives not only the movement of bodies but also the meaning of events, then the question is not who built it, but what is rewritten within it when the world above begins to change. These underground halls are not locked. They are like a frozen breath, like the silence between heartbeats. We are accustomed to thinking that architecture is physics, but perhaps Rome knew. Architecture is also memory, and until it is destroyed, something within it still remembers. Places that are not on the map. One of the strangest phenomena associated with the history of Rome remains the so-called silent zones, areas mentioned in ancient texts but do not correspond to any modern location. These are not simply errors of ancient cartographers. These are spaces whose existence is confirmed through repeated descriptions, but which seem to have disappeared not physically, but conceptually, as if a certain location had been removed from general perception, leaving only a trace in the memory of sources. An example is the mysterious Oppidum Tertium, a third fortified point mentioned in several military chronicles from the time of Trajan. It appears as a link between two legionary camps in Germania. The reports indicate that reinforcements departed from it. It received the wounded, and it housed warehouses. But modern maps linked to these chronicles show no third Oppidum. It left no archaeological traces. Field diaries mention it, but not a single GPS measurement reveals any foundations or traces of activity. It's as if it were protocol, but not material. Such extinguished places are also found closer to the heart of Italy. In the Lazio region, there's a place where locals warn, "It's best not to enter here with a compass." There, compasses don't work, phones lose battery, and sounds are muffled. One geophysicist who tried to take measurements later recounted, "When I entered, I realized I wasn't walking into a forest, but into a memory of a forest, as if the place itself knew what was meant to be forgotten." Some late Roman sources refer to such areas as regions remisse, remitted regions. The wording is ambiguous. Remitted. To whom? And why? Some historians suggest that these are territories removed from the general structure of the city, deliberately removed from symbolic geography. Perhaps because something happened there that couldn't be recorded in the chronicles. Or conversely, it was recorded too literally. In one of his letters, Seneca mentions, "A place where every word becomes a trace." He doesn't explain where it is, but adds, "And therefore, we do not return there, lest we be read." If we take this idea literally, perhaps there were points where presence itself was fixed not in space, but in perception. Such places could not be occupied. They could only be sensed and forgotten, or left without description. A map from the early 4th century, preserved in the Vatican archives, shows 7 circles outside the boundaries of Urbis, the central part of Rome. Each circle is designated as Presentia sine forma, presence without form. There are no roads or topographical markers nearby, just circles. Researchers call this an attempt to map not physical objects, but nodes of meaning, places where the gap between what is and what appears to be occurs. 20th century, during highway construction in the Capua area, equipment failure occurred over a 60-meter stretch. Bulldozers stalled, and construction markings slipped every day, even though they were re-hammered into the ground. Finally, the area was bypassed. Archaeologists later came there and found nothing. No foundations, no layers, only tightly packed soil. But one of them wrote, "When I stand in the center, the air seems denser, and if I close my eyes, I'm not standing here." Such places were perhaps part of another level of urban structure, not built up, but muted. They were not marked, not preserved, not deified. They were points where one could not say, "I was here," because this here did not retain form. It returned to itself. Interestingly, in late Roman magic there was a ritual called locatio mentis, binding of the mind. It involved directing one's thoughts to a place that didn't physically exist, but which, according to the priests, could be opened within. One description says, "When you reach the point no one has drawn, you will understand that it wasn't you who took the step, but she." What if these silent zones were real, but not in the usual sense? Not paths and walls, but structures of perception hidden between the layers of the urban body. And if you entered them, you didn't notice. You simply left and forgot. And the place continued to wait. Words that are not supposed to be spoken. In Roman culture, words had power. Not in a metaphorical sense, but in a literal sense. A word is an action. A word is a will that has crossed a boundary. A legal formula spoken aloud began to work, even if it was later revoked. An oath was a binding force. A curse was a weapon. The empire lived in a world where speaking meant appealing to the structure of reality itself. But there were other words too. Those that weren't written down, those that weren't spoken, or, conversely, spoken only once and never again. They were called verba arcana, secret words. They weren't used publicly. They weren't taught in schools or spoken in forums. They belonged to the temple, to a ritual, to a specific moment. Some of these were sacred names of gods, not intended for everyday speech. For example, Jupiter, according to several sources, had an inner name known only to priests. It was pronounced once a year, during a closed rite. If it was pronounced by the wrong person, it was believed that the name hears it, and the thing turns inward. No one knew exactly what this meant, but one document describes a priest who lost his voice after a ritual in which the sound broke. Exorcism formulas, execratio, are another example. These weren't just curses, but structured texts carved on lead tablets, rolled up, and buried under passageways, intersections, stairways, doorways. But in some cases, these texts were written in mirror image, from right to left, sometimes without vowels. They weren't meant to be read. They were meant to activate space. One archaeologist wrote, "It's not a message, it's a slider." As if someone is starting a process but not waiting for a response. There were also words considered anchor words. They bound a person to an event. One sacrificial ritual used a 3-word formula that was forbidden to be repeated. If you spoke them, it was believed that you were engaging with the action. And even years later, everything that happened according to this formula would resonate within you. One source cites a case where a man who uttered such a formula suddenly began speaking in an unknown dialect 20 years later, at night, in his sleep, using the same phrases. The late magical tradition includes the concept of impressio verbalis, vocal imprint. In Roman demonology, it was believed that certain words were not spoken aloud, not out of superstition, but because they were imprinted in space and began to repeat themselves, not like an echo. And what about the meaning? They echo other events. Someone said them, and then, weeks later, another person suddenly says the same phrase, unfamiliar, but sounding with the same intonation. On the wall of one Mithraeum, there remains an inscription, "Noli loqui in memoriam," do not speak in memory. The meaning of this phrase is still debated. Some believe it is a call not to speak of the dead. Others believe it refers to a prohibition on creating new memory nodes with words, as if speech could connect you to what should already be forgotten. There was also the concept of a word without a carrier, a word that passed through a person but did not belong to them. Such a word could be written down, but was not understood. An example is the tablets from Umbria, which contain phrases not found in any other text. Researchers can't decipher them. But the strangest thing is, some of these phrases later surface in medieval folk magic, almost unchanged. It's as if they weren't transmitted directly, but lived within the structure of the language, appearing where needed. Psycholinguists call these semantic relics, echoes that aren't fixed to meaning but operate at the structural level. Perhaps the Romans understood this intuitively, and so they created silent zones of language, areas where a word couldn't be repeated because it didn't belong to the human world. It was like a tool. It was used and then put away. And if you accidentally pronounce such a word, not because you learned it, but because it came to you, perhaps you become not its bearer, but its conductor. With glass that shouldn't be there. We tend to think of glass as a material that appeared in ancient times in primitive forms. Amphoras, vessels, display cases. The Romans truly mastered glassblowing. Their products are still found throughout Europe. But among archaeological finds, there are objects whose origins cannot be explained by either the technology of the time or the logic of purpose. This is glass, whose properties contradict both chemistry and history. In the 1930s, during excavations of a villa in the Tivoli area, researchers discovered a fragment of a glass-like material with an unusual density. It wasn't transparent, but rather translucent, with a metallic sheen. Laboratory analysis revealed its melting point to be over 1400 degrees Celsius. This is an impossible level for the 1st century AD. But most importantly, when exposed to light, the material began to resonate. Not glow, not reflect, but produce a faint vibrational response, as if something inside it were responding. Later, glass objects were found in other places in Italy whose shape corresponded neither to utilitarian tableware nor to jewelry. One of these was an elongated disc with symmetrical holes arranged in a circle. At first glance, it looked like a lens or an optical element, but the material had a strange property. It absorbed light completely. Even under strong illumination, no light penetrated. Only a matte glare remained, as if you were looking not at an object, but into a black eye. Roman sources refer to a special category, vitrum obsidianum, black glass, born from fire, but not reproducible. One text by Pliny describes a case in which a volcanic eruption produced a material in which one could see not oneself, but what one thinks. An apt metaphor or something more? It's unclear. But the very fact that glass was perceived as a boundary between the visible and the other already speaks to its special status. The most disturbing are the objects that, according to descriptions, changed shape. There is evidence of a flask in which the water does not move, even when turned upside down. Possibly a closed glass vessel in which something more than physics was taking place. Or a ball in which the pattern changes, although it is not drawn. A semblance of an ancient kaleidoscope. Or something more serious. In a Roman tomb discovered in the mid-20th century, a round glass dome covering the deceased's head was found. It was hermetically sealed into the sarcophagus. Its interior was covered with a grid of microscopic grooves. When photographed from a certain angle, the pattern was found to align with the orbits of Jupiter and Saturn. The find was deemed an artifact without function and was soon lost. Some believe glass was used not as a material, but as a conductor. That through it, one could see not only light, but also meaning. Perhaps these were instruments for ritually focusing perception, or, as some esotericists believe, gates of attention, through which one could come into contact with that which is usually not visible. Quod lucet, non est, that which shines does not exist, was found on the walls of one of the Mithraeums. Some interpret this as a paradoxical statement about the illusory nature of the visible, but perhaps it refers to the properties of the material. Perhaps the ancient Romans were looking not for an image in glass, but for something that replaces it, an echo of another view. The strangest thing is the traces of impact from these objects. There are reports of researchers working with such artifacts experiencing headaches, sleep disturbances, and a sharp deterioration in memory. None of these pieces of glass survive in museums. Almost all of them are lost. Not a single full-fledged exhibition exists. Only black and white photographs that don't convey the texture. If we accept that glass is a film between worlds, then the question is not one of technology, but of intent. Why did the Romans create such objects? To look through them, or so that something could look back through them. And if one of these objects were found today, and someone shined a light on it, it's not a given that they would see a reflection. Perhaps they would see what they were expecting to see on the other side. Mirrors of Rome, as common in antiquity as in later eras. The Romans used polished bronze, silver, and sometimes obsidian. They reflected dimly, often cloudily, but they carried more than just an image. In Rome, a mirror wasn't just a household item. It was a tool of demarcation, an object that didn't just return a gaze, but transformed it. And some texts explicitly state, "A mirror knows not only who looks at it, it knows when." Magic mirrors are a rare but persistent theme in Roman tradition. Pliny the Elder mentions a speculum consecrantum, a consecrated mirror, into which one could not look for more than 1 minute. It was supposedly used in augury rites to read celestial signs indoors. It looked like an ordinary silver disc, but according to legend, its reflection was delayed, as if the image weren't copied but delivered from somewhere else. And if you held your gaze, you could see not what's in front of you, but what has already happened, or will happen. Some mirrors have been found in burials, especially in tombs where not priests, but architects, topographers, and geometers were buried. However, the mirrors themselves were unadorned, unsigned, and always lay face down. In one such tomb, found near Arezzo, the following phrase was carved on the back of a mirror: "Respicere non est videre." To look is not to see. But the strangest discovery was not in tombs, but in sanctuaries. Inside a temple dedicated to an unknown god in northern Italy, archaeologists discovered a system of 3 mirrors aligned along an east-west axis. When a ray of sunlight passed through a slit in the wall in the morning, the reflections overlapped and fell on the stone slab. No image appeared on it, but moisture began to appear. The design that emerged in the fog repeated a geometric pattern carved on one of the Mithraeum altars in another region, Dalmatia. It's difficult to talk about coincidence, but there is reason to believe that mirrors were used as connecting structures between distant temples. Perception in antiquity was not divided into material and spiritual. Everything was a single field. And if a reflection appeared, it was perceived not as an optical phenomenon, but as a spatial response. There was also a belief that some mirrors retained a name. If a person gazed into such a mirror for a long time during a ritual, their name would remain in the depths of the reflection and could be restored by the priest if a spirit needed to be summoned. This is not necromancy in the usual sense. It is a semantic imprint, recorded not in words, but in the structure of a gaze. According to one hypothesis, mirrors in Roman temples were used not for images, but to coordinate ritual times. Each reflection is not simply a returned image, but a displaced moment. And in theory, if you build the reflections in the correct sequence, you could see not the past or the future, but the possible. Some later philosophers called this ordo visibilis, the order of the visible. This concept encompasses the idea that the world is not unified, but that each perspective constructs its own version. Mirrors, especially in ritual constructions, could be an instrument for bringing together gazes, in which an event occurred only when it was reflected twice, from the outside and from the inside. A strange device was found in one of the temples in Numidia, a chamber with 4 mirrors lined with smooth black stone. There were no windows or images on the walls. Inside there was silence, and everything sounded wrong. When the researcher entered and turned on the dim light, he saw his reflection, but it didn't move. It took a few seconds, and only then did it catch up with him, as if the mirror was waiting for a command. If we take this not as an illusion, but as an effect, then perhaps the Romans used mirrors as tools for setting events, not magical, architectural, simple in form, profound in impact. And then it becomes clear. Mirrors in the Roman tradition are not images. They are observation structures that can work in both directions. And perhaps when you look into one of them, the question is not who you see, but whether it sees you back. Silent slopes. Places in Italy that seem to escape notice, not because they are hidden, but because nothing lingers in them. These are the so-called silent slopes, land formations associated with ancient roads, pilgrimage routes, or sites where temples once stood. But unlike other landmarks of the Roman Empire, these sites are impossible to retain in memory. They are described, photographed, marked on maps, and then forgotten again. Not literally, but as if the territory itself repels attention. The first mention of such slopes is in the writings of the 1st century BC Roman geometer, Marcus Vibius Livius. He described a patch of land where shadows move in a direction other than the sun. At the time, this was considered an optical illusion. But later, in medieval chronicles, similar descriptions appear. Sections of road where horses stop, birds stop singing, and the sound of footsteps disappears. On the map, it's an ordinary place. In reality, it's a spatial pause. Modern archaeologists attribute this to geology, underground voids, magnetic anomalies, and vegetation characteristics, but local residents say otherwise. Rumors circulate in the villages that prayers are not heard on the slopes. You can't read aloud there. Words don't bounce. People become disoriented. There have been cases where groups of tourists who passed through such a zone couldn't remember the exact moment they exited, not because they got lost, but because the event had smoothed out. In one such place, on the border of Lazio and Umbria, an altar was found. No inscription, no decoration, just a stone block, perfectly cut into the slope, surrounded by 3 notches that looked like footprints. But they weren't human. They were too long, too straight. Nearby were drawings, circles, waves, spirals. They looked childish, but dating placed them back to the 2nd century. And most importantly, the altar didn't cast a shadow, not at any hour of the day. In another case, near Naples, a silent courtyard was discovered. It is a ruined building dating to the late Republican period. It has 4 walls and no roof. Inside, the floor is made of black tuff, perfectly smooth. And if you enter, the voice fades, not a hum, not an echo. It's a sound absorption, as if in a soundproof studio. But all around is open space, not a single trace of technology. On the wall is a phrase, almost indistinguishable. Hic nulla vox revertitur. Here not a single voice returns. There's a theory that the Romans deliberately created such zones, not for habitation, not for worship, but as places of erasure, points where that which was destined to disappear, not physically, but in meaning, was erased. They weren't cut down, built over, or destroyed. They were simply left alone, because they knew that if they were interfered with, what had been forgotten might reveal itself. Some Stoic philosophers said that space has its own will. It allows or rejects not based on people, but on conformity. And if a person finds themselves in the wrong place, space does not register their presence. That is, they are there, but they leave no trace, as if they passed through. Another phenomenon may be related to this, the absence of archaeological layers. There are regions where there should have been traces of life, roads, trade, caravans, but there is nothing. Only a smooth expanse of grass, in which ground-penetrating radar detects voids. No bones, no charcoal, no debris. It is as if no one has ever stopped here, even though the text claims otherwise. Roman engineers knew how to build in any terrain, but nothing was built in these places, and this too was a choice. There were lands that were not cultivated, not because the soil was poor, but because there was no stability there. The wording is strange, but it is repeated in several Latin sources. Modern observations show that antennas, towers, and concrete structures do not survive in these areas. The coverage disappears. The concrete cracks. It is as if the material itself is being pushed out of the environment. And if we accept that this is not mysticism, but some ancient principle, then it becomes clear. Rome not only created the world, it left voids in it. Not mistakes, not abandonment, but excised pauses, places that speak not of what is there, but of what is not. Maybe something can still be heard in these zones, not with the ears, not with the voice, but with an inner knowledge. One shouldn't be here. And maybe it's precisely because there was something here that shouldn't return. Negotiators. The Roman Empire, as we know, was fought not only in wars, but also in negotiations. Diplomacy, bribery, secret agreements. All of this existed long before the emergence of medieval political culture. But beyond the familiar functions of ambassadors and governors, the Roman system mentions a special category of people. They were called interloqui, literally, those who negotiate. But what they did had nothing to do with diplomacy in the usual sense. Only a few references survive. They are fragmentary, but repeated with eerie precision. One source describes the interloqui as those who can speak to walls, another as mediators between the center and what is beyond the roads. A third reports, when there is no more formula and words are not accepted, he comes and does not speak for himself, but speaks with others who are nearby. Who are these others? Where are these walls? What is this off-road? There are no answers. But it is known that interloqui acted in situations that the Romans called perturbatio rerum, the breakdown of things. These could be epidemics, uprisings, natural anomalies. But in some cases, there were the disappearance of settlements, mass ritual deviations, and nights on which morning did not come. At such moments, they didn't call on soldiers, or priests, or engineers. They called on him, one or two, people who didn't do anything with their hands, but after them, everything took shape again. Sometimes the interloqui were called silenteri, bearers of silence. One ritual, described in a 4th century treatise, requires such a person to walk along the perimeter of the afflicted area without uttering a word, looking only forward, and returning exactly the same way. Not a step to the side, not a glance back. It was believed that he was collecting the glitch, as if a disruption in the structure of the world could be closed back through human attention. Were these priests? No. Ordinary priests acted within the framework of temple ritual. But the interloqui came to places where the temple was idle, where words no longer resonated, where sacrifices were not accepted, where the air remained still, even in the wind. The description of the fire on Capitol Hill mentions a figure who came without a name, but in clothes they did not recognize. He did not interfere with the firefighting efforts. He stood and watched. And the next day, the fire died down without explanation. The Chronicle says, and then they realized, not all fires can be extinguished with water. Later, in the Christian era, these figures became associated with danger. Some monastic records refer to them as walking between times, and monks tried to ignore them. It was believed that if you entered into a conversation with such a person, you would begin to hear phrases that did not belong to you, and one day you would say something that you did not decide to say. Physically, interloqui are described as ordinary men, often dressed in dark clothing and walking quietly. But one element always recurred. They never had a permanent home. After completing their task, they disappeared. In some accounts, he disappeared around the corner. In others, he was known by his presence, but not by his face. An interesting case comes from Britain, where during excavations of an old Roman fort, a parchment almost intact was found. On it is a speech that someone wrote down from memory. It begins as a typical statement. You called me when the wall stopped listening. And then, incomprehensible phrases. The third line is shaking. The left wheel is bleeding. Put it back, but not under yourself. Nobody knows what it means. But the last line at the bottom is written in a different handwriting. He is gone. And now we see the house. A theory that interloquis didn't solve problems. They restored symmetry. Sometimes at the cost of knowledge, sometimes at the cost of time. If everything that happens is structured, then a breakdown in it can be negotiated rather than fixed. Not in the sense of words, in the sense of rhythm. And these people were like resonators. Becoming part of the distorted, they took on the tension and carried it away. Some researchers believe that followers of the interloqui may have survived into the late Middle Ages, disappearing into the figures of mute advisors, passing sages, those who were simply there. They left no trace, only the tranquility of their presence. And if somewhere in a modern city you feel that the situation is smoothed out for no reason, and you remember a face that you don't remember, perhaps he was nearby. From the wall with rewritten inscriptions. Rome was a civilization of inscriptions. Stone tablets, marble fragments, bronze plaques. Everything was recorded. The names of emperors, laws, the sizes of offerings to the gods, the list of consuls. But among these official inscriptions, others are sometimes found. They don't reflect events, but seem to insert new ones. These are called inverse inscriptions, texts that appeared on an already known wall later, without altering the carving marks, but changing the content. It's as if someone didn't just carve the stone, but rewrote the meaning. The first documented mention is of a column in the Forum Boviari Square. In the 17th century, scholars recorded a Latin inscription on it beginning with the words Pro Gloria Aeterna. 100 years later, upon re-examination, the inscription began with Pro Memoria Arcana. The stone has not been changed. The letters are the same, but the wording is different. Later, early engravings were discovered, clearly showing the old text. Modern photographs show something different. No restorer has officially worked on the object, but the wall itself seems to have been renewed. In the crypts in northern Rome, there's a fragment of a fresco that reads, Hic scriptura non manet. The inscription here is not preserved. For a long time, it was thought to be an artistic metaphor. Until 1998, a researcher noticed that the phrase on the wall had disappeared. Then it returned, but with a different arrangement of letters. One gets the feeling that in some places the text is not engraved, but inscribed into the structure of reality, and its reading depends on more than just the eyes. One Mithraeum describes a ritual in which the participant was required to walk along a wall with their eyes closed and recite the words that came to mind. The text spoken by different people in this place coincided in meaning, not in form, but in the direction of thought, as if the wall itself led the person to a certain formulation. Marble-lined room was discovered in southern Italy. In its center is a pedestal. There are no windows or doors. The interior is covered in inscriptions, but they can only be seen at certain angles of light. Under normal lighting, it's a smooth surface. But if you light a candle and swirl it, the words begin to appear, and each reading is different. Photographs capture the text, but if the person returns a day later, the letters in the photo and in reality don't match. The theory held that certain objects are not simply carriers of information, but active editors. They don't preserve the text. They reflect it like a mirror, not visually, but semantically. And if you approach it with a different frame of mind, you'll see a different text. Not a metaphor, but letters. 13th century monastery archive contains a text attributed to a monk who converted from Catholicism to Gnosticism. In it, he writes, "I entered a hall where the wall knew my name. It was not written, but it resounded within me. And what I said was not my own words, but what had already been said." Official history denies this, but scholars note a recurrence. Certain Roman walls repeat words that are not written. 2003 experiment attempted to test this. Several researchers took turns working in a Roman vault where an inscription had previously been lost for a week. They all independently began writing the same formula, in different words, but with the same meaning. No one prompted, but the wall dictated. Can we say that the Romans knew about this? Perhaps. There are texts that describe the act of revisio silenti, rewriting silence. This is not a ritual, but a state in which the place itself renews within itself what was said, leaving only the essence, changing the form. This is not erasure. This is a revoicing. What if certain buildings in Rome were constructed not only of stone, but also of structures of repetition? What if, upon entering them, one encountered not a reflection of oneself, but a text that had always been waiting to be spoken through oneself? And if one day you find yourself in a place where the inscription changes angle, where the letters waver in the gloom, where a thought comes before comprehension, maybe it's not a coincidence. Perhaps you've entered a memory that can speak, and was only waiting for your tongue to speak again. Formula outside the city. In the outskirts of Rome, outside the usual urban layout, there are old roads that do not lead to settlements. They do not coincide with military routes, do not go to ports, and do not follow the path of aqueducts. These roads end in nothing, an open field, a forest, a hill, but they weren't built by barbarians. The stonework, the engineering, the style, everything points to a Roman origin. The question is, why? And they are known as viae conclusi, closed roads. The wording is strange. How can a road be closed if it is built? One early source indicates that such paths were intended not for travel, but for pronunciation. What this means is not explained. But in several documents the phrase is repeated. After going beyond the last crossroad, the word is heard differently. Some believe that these roads were used for pilgrimages in the opposite direction, not to the temple, but from it. In Roman mysticism, there is a ritual known as regressus, a return to the starting point not in space, but in meaning. A person who has completed this path would, as it were, close their own trajectory and, according to legend, be able to close the loop. Archaeologists who examined one of these roads in the Sutri area discovered that the last 300 meters of paving differed in composition. The stones were denser, the sound of footsteps was muffled, and the compass deviated slightly. On both sides of the road are the remains of low walls with mica inclusions. No text explains their purpose, but nearby is a stone with the inscription, Verbum ibi figitur. This translates as, "The word is fixed here." A word is not a name, not a formula. A word as an essence. Perhaps what was meant was a recording, not in letters, but in the body. A person having walked a road, left behind not himself, but what was spoken within him, even if he was silent. It is hypothesized that such roads led to points where the Romans performed not rituals, but rather the consolidation of reality. One treatise on magic describes the term ordo restituendi, the order of return. It had no fixed formula. It wasn't a text, but a state achieved through movement. Perhaps following a specific route with inner intention rewrites the event, not in the past, but in its effect. In 1972, a group of researchers discovered 10 identical stone slabs along one of these roads, each of which had an engraving, a wavy line leading into a spiral. None of the symbols were labeled, but if you line them up, a sense of repeating sequence emerges, as if the road itself were a reading. It's not you walking along it. It's the road reading you. There is a mysterious text attributed to the poet Junius Sylvanus, in which he describes a path without a goal, leading to a name. He writes, "I did not know where I was going, but when I stopped, I realized the whole path was a word. And now, standing on it, I am its last letter." This is not a poetic image. It is a structure in which the route becomes a sentence, and movement a grammatical action. In Roman religion, movement was not separated from meaning, and perhaps certain roads were active texts, intended not for the feet, but for activating that which lies beyond words, as if by walking along them, you were completing a process that began long before your birth. Near one of these roads, a cylindrical stone was found with the inscription, "Finis non hic," the end is not here. Some have read this as a sign that the journey continues. But there is another interpretation. The end is not in space. It's in what you must understand before you reach it. And if you don't understand, the journey is not finished. What if the Romans built not only cities, forums, and temples, but also meanings laid out in space? What if a road is a formula, and the stones are its letters? And if you walk such a road with the right intention, it reveals what is hidden, not even from the eyes, but from the very passage of time. And perhaps it was on such roads that formulas were born that weren't written down in books, formulas that emerged in reality and changed the trajectory of events. The city that cannot be named. Rome is called the Eternal City, but some late antique texts mention a second Rome, not Constantinople, not a mythical prototype, but a city that cannot be marked on a map, but which, in the words of some philosophers, moved with the present without casting a shadow. It was called by different names: Urbs Interior, Speculum Urbis, Domus Muta, Inner City, Mirror of the City, Silent House. This is not a metaphor. Some priestly treatises explicitly state that some rituals were performed not in a physical location, but in a repeated form. This was not a temple, not a symbol, but a structure that was entered mentally, but from which one emerged physically transformed. There is a fragment of a letter from a late Roman senator to an unknown addressee. He writes, "I have found the entrance. It is not a door, it is a refusal of the road. When I stand at the right point, the city responds. Its streets are silent, but they remember. Its temples do not call, but they watch. And if you say its name, it disappears. That is why we do not say it. We simply return." What is this place? Did it literally exist? Or did the Romans realize that some forms don't require matter to function? That a city isn't just walls, but a mental order that can be tuned so that only the right things happen within it? And then, the Rome we know isn't the only Rome. That's the outer layer. And underneath is a city built of gestures, names, roots, words that can't be repeated. And when the temple was destroyed, it didn't disappear. He switched. The entrance to it was no longer under the arch, but in a pause, in silence, in a mirror in which you can't see, but you feel that you are seen. If you collect all the oddities found over the centuries, non-working doors, statues without faces, walls without meaning, endless roads, texts without letters, you will see not fragments of an empire, but the framework of another city, built into the first. It is never mentioned out loud, but it is repeated in every ritual, in every formula, in every stone that is not explained. It was not invented. It was admitted. And perhaps everything we thought was left behind isn't ruins. It's traces of a passing. Because that city didn't fall. It detached itself. It crossed into another dimension. Not up, not down, but sideways, to where everything continues. but without us. In Roman philosophy, there was a term relicta orbis, the fallen world. This isn't hell, not nothingness. It's something that is no longer fixed by the structure of reality, but still exists as a possibility. Perhaps Rome left just such a mark, and that is why it is eternal. Not because it has not been destroyed, but because everything we find tells us that it is not yet finished. We're used to thinking of Rome as a closed chapter in history. The chronology, the architecture, the emperors, the fall, everything is clear. Everything is documented. But the deeper we look, the more attentively we listen to the silence between the columns, the more clearly something else becomes clear. Something remains unfinished. We saw roads that lead nowhere, but seem to await steps. Temples built without gods, walls that speak only in the absence of speech, glass that reflects not appearance, but intention, texts that change when looked at, and names that disappear not from time, but from the attempt to pronounce them. Perhaps Rome wasn't just a city. It was a tuning system, not of the outside world, but of what lies between us and it. And when we encounter the inexplicable in this history, we don't discover something new. We merely stumble upon something that hasn't yet been completely erased. Empires collapse. Cities fade away. Books burn, but structures remain. They cannot be destroyed because they are not made of stone. They are in roots, in gestures, in lines that repeat through the centuries. And maybe we are not looking for ancient Rome. Maybe it is looking for us.